92% of the US GDP growth that we've had has come from data centers. So without the data center growth, GDP growth in the US would be 0.1%.
I talk to folks all the time who raise a Series A and almost do it with dread.
I would love my home to be my biggest robot.
I see a healthcare system that, especially in the finance of healthcare, is just completely broken. And
I think you have some of the most talented people in the world saying software is going to be commoditized. What can I do in kind of the atoms spaces of the world, right?
There are more H100s in China than maybe anybody thought or knew about.
Every company wants a head of storytelling.
As an entrepreneur, sometimes really good businesses are boring, and really interesting ideas aren't good businesses.
Building an AI note taker, by definition, isn't interesting. But building one of the fastest growing startups in the world is very interesting.
I think goal for 2026 is, I want to make some robots, dude. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Restart Pod. It's been a really good year. We had a really fun year running companies and starting new ones. But we wanted to take this last episode of like the podcast before the holiday season to kind of look back on what happened in 2025. It was honestly feels like a pretty significant year for AI and tech, and a lot of things changed. Shashi, I mean, I think the conversation has shifted the most at the very, very bottom of the stack. Like, it's very, very unusual. You want to maybe open us up to that dialogue and talk about what happened in 2025?
Yeah, I think the most important story of 2025 and really the decade that we're in is the data center build out. It's 92, let me give you some numbers. 92% of the US GDP growth that we've had has come from data centers. So without the data center growth, GDP growth in the US would be 0.1%. It's a huge percentage of our overall growth in our country. And data centers includes the power, it includes the land development, it includes the cooling and racks, it includes Nvidia chips and all of the server providers, the AMDs of the world. This is a massive innovation that has happened in 2025. And let me just take you into Nvidia, because while we've talked about Nvidia a lot, I think it's just worth taking a zoomed out perspective. Over the last 3 years, Nvidia is up nearly 1,000% on their stock price. The market cap is between $4 and $4.5 trillion. I've repeated here on this pod that I think it is inevitably going to go to 10 trillion. There is not a near substitute provider for what Nvidia does. And while you continue to hear announcements of others wanting to launch their own chips, none of those are going to be in the near term competitors to Nvidia. So I think Nvidia has an incredible moat and advantage in their positioning in their market. And so I just wanted to start this conversation by saying, let's acknowledge the importance of data centers and what they've meant to the economy and what they've meant to the entire tech stack.
Yeah, it's funny because I follow like a good number of like, not financial channels, but I think a lot more people my age are becoming like very financially conscious. And a lot of people like hold ETFs. Like, ETFs is a very common thing. Like, you hold like some index of the S&P 500 or whatever. And there are a lot of people who are getting very, very scared that like, hey, wait a second. Like, with the current state of the economy, my ETF is basically just like an Nvidia proxy, with how like substantial it is in propping up the entire economy, basically. I think I very much agree. I think Nvidia is very nicely positioned. There are some people who are like pointing out, like, they look at the .com bubble and they're like, oh, is Nvidia just going to end up like these fiber optic companies back in the day did, where they end up building a lot and serving a lot of use cases, but those use cases don't manifest quickly enough. But the matter of fact is, like, their supplier, they have too much demand that they still cannot meet. Like, they're booked out on deals for like the next like half decade, trivially, right? I think with the year started off with Project Stargate, so that was like a pretty hot announcement to kick off the year. Like, especially just coming off the election, we saw a bunch of tech CEOs kind of forming handshakes with the government to like launch this infrastructure build out. I think at the time, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, it sounded a little bit fictitious. Like when we were first talking about, like, I was like, oh, it's going to take a couple of years to like materialize and come along. But it's kind of hit like growing scale really, really, really quickly. Like a lot sooner than I expected, and being a lot more impactful than I would have expected to be within the course of just a couple of quarters, really. Where we've seen like walkthroughs of Amazon's new data centers, OpenAI's investments, all that kind of stuff, um, all within like 8 to 9 months of that announcement being made public.
I think that the through line for me is as large language models kind of burst onto the scene, in roughly 2 years ago, what became apparent very quickly was that the choke point for realizing some of the ambitions of that technology was data centers. It was power, it was compute, it was all these things. And so what you saw was an incredible, I think, gravity towards trying to build that out. And then that coincided with a public sentiment and an elected administration that was looking to onshore some of these things. And so at the same time, we had a great new technology that was in need of power and data centers. We also had increased incentive to build these things out here, kind of in the U.S., or at least, reasonably so, kind of nearest neighbors, that kind of thing. And so I think just the confluence of those two, maybe three factors led to this boom in it. And then what we've also seen is kind of, at least, me kind of being an observer of the space, is as large language models have gotten increasingly better at coding, I think you have some of the most talented people in the world saying software is going to be commoditized. What can I do in kind of the atoms spaces of the world, right? This will be extended in a conversation later on, maybe today or otherwise, when we speak about robotics and other kind of real world things. But I think this also runs kind of to both poles of the stack, if you will, all the way to data centers, right? How do we make data more efficient? How do we make data more powerful? Where can we put these data centers, right? If that includes on Earth, as we kind of alluded to last episode, in space, that kind of thing. And I think what you have is this maybe collective consciousness of software used to be kind of, the first and foremost for a lot of the smartest people coming out of universities or otherwise. And we've just, I think, identified a new piece of the value chain, and we've got talented people heading in that direction. And anytime you have the most valuable company in the world, being in the middle of that sector, you're just going to draw talent.
Yeah, my dad watches the podcast. He's one of the people who gives me the high retention percentages. But he's his background's in semiconductors. I keep telling him like, dude, please just make like a chip company like right now. Like there's like no better time in the world to be a founder who knows hardware, like manufacturing things generally. Where I think like we've said this before and like I've referenced it before, but like it's so I think whereas before, like I was getting really sick of software. I'm in that category that Damon was referring to, but I'm in this category of like Silicon Valley feels like Silicon Valley should right now, where it's like go back to like actually doing cool engineering, try novel science, like solve like physical problems in the real world, and like do something unusual, right? Like we're coming out of this like very like ZERP SaaS era that lasted for so long and made like B2B SaaS like a ticket to like the pearly gates, but not something that was like fun or exciting or pushing the world forward a little bit. Um, I think like we're seeing a lot of the changes, I guess like a lot. I would be curious like Damon, like as a VC, what you're seeing in regards to like companies being formed and pitched to you, especially with the younger grads, where I think it was really easy to start software codes. Are you seeing a lot more people like kind of having a little bit more courage to do something harder? Does that feel generally true? Or is it still
Yeah, I
something
don't
that's
know.
like kept to veterans per se?
Yeah, I don't know if I would classify it as courage, just because I just don't know. Like, I think courage is a possible, kind of influence into going there. I also think that it's just becoming, going back to this software becoming increasingly commoditized, it's also becoming increasingly competitive. And so if you can't just kind of break through almost immediately with successful software, you're just kind of driven into other projects. And I think that, we can debate at length about, are software modes still a thing? Were software modes ever really a thing? I think we can go back and forth on that. But I think the takeaway in this day and time is it's a lot easier to ideate how you're going to build something that sounds very, very hard to build and how you're going to kind of carve a niche down that lane than it is to kind of spin up an AI agent for X and be in a pool of 10 other companies that are building the exact same thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll talk about some of the companies that are doing really, really well, I think, momentarily. Um, I think naturally, with all this investment, a lot of it's coming from what people are worried about are these circular deals, et cetera. But I think this year was also a pretty interesting year for the competitive landscape of the model providers. A lot of them are the ones investing in all this infrastructure themselves by some nefarious and bunny ears. But these circular deals, OpenAI obviously has been the champion for the longest time, but this year opened up with DeepSeek, which I think has been like one of the biggest, probably like quote unquote, upsets to how people were thinking about model providers from the beginning. Um, for those who aren't aware, I mean, like I think in the common vernacular, DeepSeek was a Chinese model that was produced that trained allegedly on a much less significant amount of costs compared to a comparative OpenAI model, was able to run much cheaper. Cost of inference was much cheaper. This model release, and in the same way that OpenAI had a recent code red related to Gemini, they had a code red related to DeepSeek, because it was the first kind of case of like, we have a SOTA model, like state of the art model that was trained for less and didn't cost the same amount of like investment that cost OpenAI to make their original model. But DeepSeek had come along cheaper, same level of quality, faster, like cheaper to develop with, basically out of nowhere. And it upset everything because all of a sudden you could hop to DeepSeek, you could hop away from OpenAI, and it all of a sudden seemed like the competitive moat had just gone. And that seems to still be a little bit of the case.
DeepSeek caught everybody by surprise in January when it came out. And as we unpacked the DeepSeek model, what they did, I think the two learnings that came out of that: one, you could take some shortcuts. The model training process took some shortcuts in training that made it less expensive to train, needed a little bit less hardware, and the model still turned out really good. And I think what was really surprising. The second thing was, there are more H100s in China than maybe anybody thought or knew about. And so the Chinese government somehow found a way to get enough H100s, perhaps through Singapore, to train a state-of-the-art model. So both of those things, I think, were like the surprises and the learnings.
Right.
In terms of efficient training, the lessons learned from DeepSeek were largely incorporated in the mini models, the kind of the smaller, faster models. And I think that was value add because DeepSeek published papers on what they did, and so it became public domain. But I think what we're finding is that this lane that the Chinese strategy has been, which is the open source lane, hasn't really kept up, including Llama. You see the same problem with Meta. Llama hasn't really kept up with the big, well-funded for-profit labs. And so where do we end the year? We end 2025 with two models, Gemini 3 and Opus 4.5, Claude Opus 4.5, that are really, really good and substantially better than any of the open source models. And I think we're getting to the point in the technology adoption curve where people are seeing not just that they are cool and interesting and could be impactful in the future, but they're starting to be really impactful now. And those two models, I think, have changed perception as we finish out 2025.
There's an interesting thing. I had heard about this like kind of secondhand. But apparently, so obviously tariffs started hitting between our government and China, that influenced specifically Nvidia's ability to sell their chips to China. And it's interesting because obviously DeepSeek came out swinging. The DeepSeek model is very, very good. But what ended up happening is that over the course of the year, as like Nvidia chips stopped being available to China, they've since now been returned to being available. But during the period that they were limited on how many like Blackwell chips that they could get access to and that sort of thing, obviously with like Chinese censorship, you can't like so publicly criticize like governmental choices or that sort of like foreign exchange. But there are hints in some of the academic papers published that like we were limited by the like Huawei chips that we were like we're using to train on, like the Nvidia chips were like better for our training purposes. So there has been a little bit of like a geopolitical reason that sort of research has kind of stalled from China. But it's interesting. I mean, like looking at what ended up happening, Claude 4, or I guess like the Sonnet 4 set of models, like a number of them came out this year. Anthropic had a really great year. I think they've just continued to reinforce a coding dominance, which has kind of become one of the predominant uses of all these tokens. I think the OpenAI's positioning has continued to be winning in consumer. I don't think they've really been truly displaced. I think a lot of the Gemini and Anthropic attempts to pull away from OpenAI haven't worked in consumer use cases, but we're seeing a lot more developers using more models for unusual things, I think, compared to last year, where I think like using a not gigantic tech companies model was a fairly rare thing last year. I think it's becoming more commonplace now. Like there's more incentive structure between switching, and it's easier to switch over more now than before.
I think the most interesting thing to me is in this trying to project forward a little bit I think for the last, certainly this year and maybe even the year prior, we had been fairly limited in the scaling advantages that we had seen in the pre-training steps. We had kind of hit basically a saturation point, kind of a point of diminishing returns with pre-training, and we relied on things either post-training and or somewhat reasoning, chain of thought, those kind of mixture of experts, those kind of techniques, in order to kind of continue to push the stride, to push the kind of capabilities of these foundation models, these LLMs and other models forward. I think that what we're going to finally see is a little bit of maturing with the Blackwell chips going forward, and I think what that might result in is the private or these privately funded models continuing to outpace open source. These hyperscalers are going to have access to more Blackwell chips. They're going to have access to more, kind of the most pre-training data. And if we return back to traditional scaling laws in the pre-training steps, I actually think you're going to see kind of a compounding advantage being given to these private models compared to open source. And anytime, those chip advancements trickle down to the open source, you'll kind of start to see them close that gap. And I think you'll kind of constantly see this like almost accordion effect where you kind of see this, this expansion and the shrinking. I think the other interesting question to me becomes, for how many use cases is good enough? Meaning, at how many different use cases, like obviously scientific discovery or something like that, you're always going to want to be on the bleeding edge. But if I seem to rewrite an email or something, when is edge AI and kind of these open source models and these kind of things going to be good enough? 2026 might actually be the first time we start to see almost a segmentation in the market where, it's similar to how like Cursor runs an auto, model switching, basically, where it kind of is smartly inferring which model is best suited for the job. It's trying to optimize for cost and speed, going like that. I think that you're going to see this kind of integrated across the tech stack, especially so long as the chips remained constrained, right? Like you're not going to be able to use Gemini 3 and Opus 4.5 and whatever the leading model is from XAI or OpenAI or otherwise for every task. It's going to be too cost prohibitive. It's going to be too kind of token intense. And so I think you're going to see some smart routing, for lack of a better term, from these companies, probably mostly under the hood. I don't think they're going to, have users selecting their models. I think they're going to have kind of an auto toggle or a select your model toggle, and then it's going to kind of be streamed to the users that way. But that's kind of the way I see it. I think we've been kind of at a little bit of a pause in the pre-training scaling laws, and with Blackwell, we have our first potential to return to that. And if we in fact do see that, we're basically going to see, the Colossus 2 cluster as an example from XAI producing the best model in the world. Whoever can build out the most kind of data centers, going back to the earlier conversation, for these pre-training steps, and you can actually make a coherent data center. I think people underestimate or undersell the difficulty of training really large clusters, or rather setting up really large clusters for pre-training. I think everybody kind of just views it as plug in GPUs, set program on, and resultant model comes out. And I think what we're finding is that just simply is not the case.
Go ahead, Shashi. I was going to start a kind of new thread.
As we look to 2026, I'm curious what you think of. I've got several questions for you, but the one that's top of mind is about Apple. It's about edge compute. Apple hasn't really gotten into the game yet in terms of AI, in terms of models. Siri continues to be terrible, and yet the strategy still sits in in Apple's hands to deliver this edge compute, small, local only model. What do you expect in 2026 for edge compute?
Damon, you go first if you have a
Yeah.
thought.
Nothing. In short,
Oh,
to be honest,
oh,
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
That was not
I
what I
mean,
was gonna say.
yeah, I don't think. I mean, we'll see, right? But I mean, I think if I was going to project it forward, you're going to see much the same in that ChatGPT is going to get better, Gemini is going to get better, these chatbots are going to get better, the APIs are going to get better, and Apple is going to take a wait and see approach. I think you'll start to see incremental improvements for Siri. I actually think maybe somewhat of an odd take here, but I think the reason that Siri is so bad is because the use cases of an on-device iPhone currently aren't clear. There aren't a lot of cases in which you want your interface to be voice other than just conversational learning. Like, I don't want to be typing an email via voice, right? I don't really want to be typing a text via voice. I don't really want to be doing anything that involves Siri via voice. And so I think the reason that you have seen Siri lag is quite frankly because the Apple user isn't clamoring for an improved Siri. And so I think you'll still continue to see Apple slow roll this. Now, Lakshya, I don't know if this is where you were going, but in other aspects, I think you'll see kind of edge compute take off, right? If we're talking about drone technology or something like that, that's a different story to me entirely. Over there, I think we'll see some advancements in localized AI. I think we'll start to see kind of, Internet of Things type approach in that. But as far as how the consumers interact with edge AI or not, like I think you're still going to send it to the cloud. I think you're still going to see ChatGPT being the kind of go-to, LLM assistant on the iPhone more than you'll see kind of a localized Siri slash, Gemini integration.
My take, so like I kind of like I think Dan and I were saying more of the same thing than I realized. Like one, I'm very, very bullish, like drones and secondary edge tech taking off. I think 2026 is a year that like we've seen enough companies start to do it that I think in the same way that like around the time Apple is being born, there are just so many like PC hobbyists. I think you will begin to see robotics hobbyists take off. I think there's enough tooling out there to actually kind of get started pocketing that. I think the thing that ends up happening, I think, for these big tech companies like OpenAI with Microsoft, Google, Apple, is it might not be so much the phone or the watch that's doing this like possible work, but every one of these companies has some kind of like home kit. They have some kind of at-home device that does some level of like localized inference. I'm not going to say the one that will trigger the one in my room because that'd be really annoying, but Amazon has theirs, Apple has theirs, and all of them have like a vocal trigger of some shape. Most of these devices are not so compute intensive that they can do something locally. But when you consider the whole like network of things available to you, like the headphones, the watch, the like home kits, whatever, I think there is a pending singular startup that does something really interesting with home kits or something like similar. Like they tried to release a home device that gets like public attention that then ends up leading to a lot of mimicry from the Googles, the Apples, the Amazons of the world in the product that they already have released, just not enabled in that way. But I think with the existing landscape, I don't think it ends up being the phone that takes off all of a sudden. I think it ends up being the like peripherals that exist within these tech companies' ecosystems that hopefully then resounds with a little bit more energy.
Do you have out of curiosity, do you have for example, in the home kit use case? Because for the record, I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I'm struggling to imagine the use case that the current home kits can't reasonably accomplish and kind of need an LLM or a similarly capable system to kind of go to.
I mean, I genuinely think like the basic thing that will probably most realistically happen is that like the Google HomeKit, whatever it's called, I don't know its name. It has a different name. In the same way that we like get like the same way that the Amazon ones are used for shopping, I anticipate that you'll begin to see like better LM inference being used for the same sort of like at home advertising use cases that feels a little bit more conversational. Because right now, like if you ping a question to the Amazon one, it will say like a very programmatic thing. It feels kind of out of place, like it's not super clean. Whereas we have better vocal models now. We have better like LLMs that are capable of generating like very nicely flowing text. It might literally be as simple as like giving more personality to the home kits. I anticipate. I don't think it ends up being like some novel use case, like reply to my emails or book my Uber or something like that. It could be, but I think that still ends up going to cloud. Like I think it starts off as a very simple, like some of these devices have a privacy orientation. It makes sense that you'd inject a really small model to do the like quality of text generation that still allows you to serve commerce use cases and reminder use cases or conversational use cases.
I want to say that if Siri works better, that I would use it for a lot of things. Like if
Mhm.
I'm cold, I would love to just say, make it warmer. Like some very
Yeah,
simple command. And I have HomeKit. I have speakers. I've got thermostats. Like everything's connected up. But Apple
yeah,
just doesn't take advantage of it. And if there was some like significant improvement in the local model, which wouldn't require, I don't think it requires the kind of chain of thought that I would need for a deep research project. It just needs to
right.
be able to functionally access all the IO devices. Just that would make a massive difference.
I have very, very wide thoughts about this and wanting to play in this space generally. Most of them come down to like the problem is that right now you either have like there's no common protocols for devices, right? Like everyone's building their own firmware, their own communication services, all that sort of stuff that like I would love for the home to be like I would love my home to be my biggest robot. I think that's the like thing that is fantastic and wanting to realize with all the IoT stuff. The problem is right now the cells of that robot are just speakers and microphones, right? And a lot of them
Mhm.
tend to be owned by one company. The things that aren't speakers and microphones aren't owned by that company and don't have a consistent communication protocol with the speakers and the
Mhm.
microphones that exist and centralized with your phone and headphones and whatever it may be. Um, so
Do you
I
remember the
anticipate
founding
something's going.
story? This makes me
Go
think of
ahead.
do you remember the founding story of Dropbox? They basically
Mm,
like reverse engineered like the file systems of a bunch of different protocols, like
mm,
in order to build like the universal folder, whatever.
yeah.
They had to like basically reverse engineer the OS. And so like
Mm,
the only engineers that could break through this kind of like complex multi-protocol mess were like the engineers that were like good enough technically to
right.
basically like hack through the OS and
Right.
make it do what they wanted. And I think it would take
Mm.
that kind of effort or innovation to align all of these systems that are not intended to work together.
Yeah, it's just I'm just like I we'll punt some of this thinking for the robotics stuff at the very end. We'll talk about robotics and humanoids and IoT because again, I think 2026 is going to be a big year for it. I think there's a lot to say there. There's a lot that I want to say there. I think until before we get to that point, I'd like to talk about the app layer of the world. Damon, you shared the companies that like we talked about infra, we talked about the models. We should talk about like what is sitting right on top of the models, and you had shared a graphic of what companies is either had raised the most or fastest growing. If you could pop open that view,
Fastest growing. Mhm.
Yeah,
yeah.
fastest growing is what is here. It essentially is Brex, which is the finance head, fintech company. Put it out. I can um pop it
Well,
up.
let's
But
look at it
basic,
and let's just say like let's say like what we notice in the chart and then like what
Hmm.
who we actually like in the chart.
Right.
Like which tech we
so
actually like.
I think the thing to um that strikes me most immediately is how many of these companies almost seamlessly integrate with LLMs, especially with respect to coding. So like you'll see here cursors number one, um, Firecrawl number seven, Replit, which is a vibe coding tool number nine, Exa's people search via API number 10, Grok, which is basically inference layer, is 12, um, Apollo 18, Langchain 22, Supabase 23, Vercel 27. All of these have a very kind of vibe cody flavor. I also
Hmm.
think that taking a step back before just diving into the list entirely is pre 2025. I think there was still debate being had amongst investors, builders, founders, etc., of how much value was going to accrue to either the model layer or the app layer, right? In the very beginning of LLM days, there was kind of almost a negative connotation around the idea of being a GPT wrapper, right? Just a kind of a very thin layer wrapped on top of a large language model. I think we've largely seen that go out window a little bit, and much more in the app layer is being funded and seeing successes. So I'll kind of pause there, wheeling this list up for you all to kind of remark on.
I mean, the biggest thing is like 2026 was like the vibe coding year. Like I think like even looking at all these companies, and most of these companies that have succeeded that are consumer facing, like not purely B2B, um, a lot of them exist in this ecosystem of like they all have shared integrations with each other that if you pop up one, there is some distribution moat that they have with each other that allows it to be really, really easy to pop up the other adjacently. I'm actually surprised Vercel's that low, to be honest. Same with Superbase. I would have expected those to be much, much higher. Cursor being number one, not surprising. They're killing it. Like I'm more than anything just stunned that Copilot is not running as fast as Cursor is, and so far as like knocking them out. But clearly, like I think classic case of like the startup is allowed to be more fast and capable than the incumbent is. So it kind of just feels like they're succeeding at running laps around what should be the default winner. Perplexity, I'm surprised they're still growing this much, but I imagine a lot of that is API usage because that web browsing use case is really, really solid. I know in some of the like the B2B stuff I've been helping other folks with, like the Perplexity chat completions has kind of been a default, like serve up for a lot of things I've done. Post Hog, really great. What I'm most surprised by is Open Router being number 2. Like I was not expecting to see Open Router this high up anywhere on the list. I knew that they're very popular. I did not know that they're doing that well, to be honest.
It's interesting to me that Kling and retail are so high. I didn't realize that Kling for video and retail for voice agents had gotten that much traction yet.
Mm-hmm.
It was on my watch list for 2026 to see those interaction modes and output modes come to full fruition. I didn't realize they had grown so much already. There are rappers like Perplexity that have a loyal fan base. People who just swear by going to Perplexity instead of directly to any model. That I find really interesting in consumer behavior. And then as you said, the enterprise tools here like Purcell and Superbase. There are several enterprise tools here that I feel like have strong lasting power at this point. The consumer ones, I feel like my intuition is that they have a lot less moat or stickiness because consumers are fickle and it's easy to switch.
Yeah, I think another thing I'll also point out. So like it's interesting. So Clay, Apollo, I assume a good number of these other ones as well. A lot of these are just like CRMs. And so for me, like one of the most common things I used to get like very bored by when I met people in SF is that there are a lot of people making AI CRMs. And so it sticks out to me that like if I were to look at buckets of things that are B2B here, there's a good number that are vibe coding obviously being like the number one in the year. There's clearly like not just, there's a lot of competitive slices to take out of like the AI CRM thing. There's also some companies in here that don't do anything AI related at all in like a true sense. They're just really convenient to put up. Like Posthog, I believe they might be adding some like AI features in the same way that the CRMs did. But Posthog is like just like a really quality product analytics product that just a lot of SF builders who are building with Cursor and are building with Superbase like to use, right? So like the more coders you see, the more likely people are to need a products analytics solution. And then Posthog becomes a very easy first pick. So it's not all purely AI, like it's not all novel AI plays over here, but there's also like looking at some of these companies, there is a touch of like some vocal AI apps, which we didn't have last year, like Whisper, which is in the number 50 spot. It's really just like kind of referring to what you were referring to earlier, where you don't imagine yourself talking into your input. All Whisper is just like it turns one of your keyboard buttons into like a microphone, basically. Like you hold it down and instead of tapping, you talk. And there are a lot of people where like with vibe coding, like you're just sitting there, like you don't want to be like flipping back and forth between the keyboard. So instead you just like click a mouse button, you talk into your mic, that's your input to your cursor usage. And then you keep coding away without having to like input so much back and forth all the time. So we are seeing like the emergence of some vocal use cases. I think we'll see a lot more in next year. Um, Video doesn't really seem to be that present on this list, not to a very significant capacity. Um, but vocal seems to be doing something like Granola, like a meeting note taker that's just recording your like meeting audio. I'm actually surprised there aren't more meeting note takers on here, but maybe they just don't recognize some of their names.
Fireflies.ai is a meeting note taker. And
Okay.
then also 11 Labs is like the most common like API for powering voice, like kind of
Right.
character voices and different voices.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a common thing. Yeah, I also don't know exactly how this list was curated, meaning like I don't know what defines the 50 fastest growing. Is that I don't know if that's revenue ramp. I don't know if that's month over month user growth. So I don't exactly know what metrics they're using to kind of track this. But anyway, interesting. And I think we have seen a large amount of value accrue to the app layer. LangChain at 22 kind of surprised me. I honestly kind of
Hmm.
thought they were falling off a little bit. I don't know. I'd be interested to see kind of their um, market share graph. I wonder if they're, kind of coming down from a peak, but still obviously very, very high, or if they have actually continued to climb despite not being, I think, forefront in the kind of, media landscape, if you will.
Yeah, I think my take. I've always been very anti LangChain. Like I find LangChain kind of annoying generally to develop with. But like I know a lot of people who I think, especially like as enterprises are trying AI, especially since a lot of them have contracts with like Google, or they already have an enterprise contract with Anthropic or that sort of thing, right? It's easier for them to go to a LangChain template and start building than it is to go to like Google's documentation sucks. Like it's absolutely awful. And you go to like a LangChain of the world and grab those docs first. You kind of end up getting pulled into the like cycle and ecosystem of LangChain that like I'm surprised they're growing this much, but it makes sense that they're still default alive. Like I understand why a lot of people were like, I'm LLM curious in my big, like, Fortune 500 company. The thing I start with is LangChain. And maybe just because I'm so used to LangChain, like in the same way I'm used to AWS or I'm used to Azure, I bring LangChain to my director and my boss and ask for an enterprise license.
Mhm.
Like, it's safe. It's not that surprising. I don't think it makes that much like true sense if you go to like fundamentals. But the matter of fact is like they have a spot, they have some decent level of like consistent value provided, so they get adopted and the enterprise value bubbles up.
I want to bring up the thing we talked about on our thread, which is as an entrepreneur, sometimes really good businesses are boring, and
Yeah.
really interesting ideas aren't good businesses. And as we
Hmm.
look at this chart, I think I see things like a meeting note taker, and I imagine myself being the entrepreneur, and I think like this would be really friggin' boring to write like a meeting note taker. But
Yep.
they grow, they make money, right? And
Yep.
and I'm just kind of curious, having we had our chat about it. We see this list of like fast growing, successful ventures. What's your thought on interesting versus financially lucrative?
No, I mean, literally, like the funniest one to me on that whole list is SERP API. I use SERP API for everything. For the record, we've used SERP API for our last company a number of times. SERP API is just like if you search on Google, it's just say like API that allows you to grab Google results. Like I don't know how they're legally defended, but like when you pay for a certain level of plan, like you get legal protections against just scraping Google. Um, but literally, all this is like Google developed all the value. They're not using any custom scrapers. They're not using custom anything. They're just a convenient API for if I type something in Google and I want to be able to surface those results into an API, it's just that ripped from a Google index page, right? And like that's like so stunningly unoriginal. And like, yes, it's really valuable. Like it makes sense that's so valuable, and a lot of people use it. I use it. Like I was literally developing with it yesterday. I typed SERP API key into my end file yesterday. Like I use it, but so bland, man. And this is where I think like it feels like Silicon Valley is coming to more of what Silicon Valley should be. I think we're seeing a lot of like, especially as the software moat goes away and commodity becomes a lot more common. There's all these companies that are winning on go to market and delivering something that's like provable plain value. Um, but so boring. Like it shouldn't be this bland, man. Like I think this list was software specific. So I'd be curious to see like if we were to do a hardware one, I imagine like Brex might not be in a position to collect like not software metrics trivially. Um, but I'm hoping it changes. I'm hoping 2026 looks like a pretty different year in which the the economics probably don't flip, but I hope we do see like a little like blip that seems unusual next year, like a very significant, unusual set of blips um, from companies that aren't B2B SaaS, like scraping some vanilla data from somewhere and surfacing it in an interesting, usable way.
I think two thoughts. Number one, back to not knowing how this list was put together, what metrics they're using. I do wonder if it's just companies using Brex and they're just highlighting it based on their spend, right, or something like that.
Yeah.
How many, like their transaction volume, as an example. But then, secondly, I think the thing that gets overlooked in the kind of subject matter of the companies is that momentum is interesting. And so, like, if you're an entrepreneur building granola, as an example, like, I think you're both correct in that building an AI note taker by definition isn't interesting, but building one of the fastest growing startups in the world is very interesting. So I think that when you're building something that's working, it can be interesting, even if the subject material isn't, intellectually stimulating or otherwise. It's when it's not working, which most startups are by definition not working all the time, that, not being engaged with the subject matter coupled with things being really hard every day gets really defeating kind of. And so I think you can either be doing something interesting and survive the downturns because what you're working on is kind of, motivating you through any, success downturns, if you will, or you can be building something that's an absolute rocket ship and you're having a great time because you're building a rocket ship and you're growing and people are talking about you in the news and your team is highly motivated because, everybody thinks they're going to do well. And so I think that, momentum in itself is kind of self-perpetuating. And so I think that you see a lot of these kind of stale apps become exciting for that. But on the counter side, like I don't know about you guys, but I talk to folks all the time who raise a Series A and almost do it with dread. And that, like, what it means is they're stuck building that company for the next 7 years or 3 years or 10 years or whatever. And so I think there's a limit to how much, momentum can propel you through something that you're just not enjoying, especially if you're not enjoying the kind of customer that you're interacting with, right? Because the conversations you're having on a day-to-day basis in those companies after you get to the one stage, right? After you have some version of product market fit, it's all just kind of sales and polishing the edges and, trying to figure out what your product portfolio is going to look like and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's all a bunch of kind of, non-flattering, non-startup-y things that just kind of become drudgery. And that drudgery kind of looks the same no matter what the, subject matter of the business is.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? It's like HR and it's like people managing and it's preparing for the next fundraise and putting a deck together. And you know what I'm saying? It's a bunch of this stuff that it all kind of becomes the same motion after you have kind of hit that initial, customer demand, I guess you would say.
Yeah. I that's a good note to transition on. I think we were like planning on talking kind of like robotics and like the more metal layer that kind of emerges here, but I'd like to maybe like take that thread or like that chapter of the conversation, just turn it into like, we went through this whole year. We all sold a SaaS company. Like, we're all looking at all the stuff that's going on right now. I'd love to just kind of talk about like individually, like for every person in this call, like how are you looking at 2026 and like what is pulling you? Like where is your gravity going and why?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first if you'd like. Um,
Sure.
I find my curiosity as my kind of leading indicator. I see a healthcare system that, especially in the finance of healthcare, is just completely broken, and so AI tooling has been used to serve insurance companies. They minimize their costs. AI tooling is being used by hospitals like Epic software package, for example, to maximize billing. And so I see a game of warfare happening in healthcare and the money of healthcare. And I see employers losing that game. And I see individual consumers losing that game. And so my curiosity leads me to want to build something in this space where the playing field gets leveled. This would be consumer and employer paid SaaS. That's where my interest leads me, and what I want to do is try to empower really smart people who care about something and create a platform for them to go build something. So that's kind of the way I see my role in that mix. It's risk taking. The app layer, as we just said, is like purely risk. And as we talked about the economics of the stack, Like, where is the bottleneck step? The bottleneck step is energy, it's data centers. Um, Model tokens are getting cheaper every year, thankfully, so that makes the app layer more affordable to play in. You can try a lot of things pretty cheaply now at the app layer. And then at the app layer, what really matters now is brand and storytelling. So the way I'm approaching entrepreneurship in 2026 is to lead with brand and lead with storytelling and let the product fill in behind as you go,
Mm.
knowing product starts off bad and imperfect, and you make it work if there's demand.
What I can do is I'll include just like a clip of your first section, your second section, what you just said, because I'm sure like I think it'll be helpful to feel like how many people resonate with that in like our comment section, that sort of thing. I think that'll be good, and we can see like, hey, where does gravity pull you, and what stories you end up finding, because I do think that's very correct. I think with software becoming commoditized, like we're literally seeing like the Wall Street Journal posted an article, I think it was last week, talking about how like one of the most new hot roles that's like popping up in a lot of these like hot stage startups is like every company wants a head of storytelling, especially
Mm.
with like the amount of AI slop and everything out in the world. Like someone who can understand the user, like you're kind of a chief of staff, you're kind of a marketer person, you're kind of a brand person, but like how can you fundamentally like connect like what you're doing at a human layer to real people? And I think that is a trend that will be bigger in 2026 than it has been this year, where like everything became noisier this year than it was last year.
It was interesting. I saw some of the retort to the idea of hiring the storyteller. Some of the Gary Tan folks and others were basically, the retort was, you have one. Their title is CEO, essentially. Like if storytelling doesn't come from the top down, then it's kind of, why are you hiring something for something like this? But easier said than done in most cases.
Hard for the CEO to storytell when they're running a B2B SaaS, like,
Exactly.
like what's the story SERP APIs telling? I don't know. Hire someone to figure that out.
The thing that interests me most, I think, especially given the progress that we've seen in large language models and other, the fusion models and types of AIs, anytime you have these inflection points in technology, the thing that I'm biasing for is things that weren't possible before and short feedback loops. So basically, trying to fortune tell your way to any of these things are very challenging. It's very hard to know kind of high priority before you do things, if they're going to work or not. So I'm always kind of biasing and thinking about how long is the feedback loop until I'm going to have more information in which to act on. That allows you to build conviction down one path or the other. And, obviously days of feedback loop is better than weeks, which is better than months, which is better than years. And so that's a lot of what I'm thinking about. What are the things that didn't exist before that exist now? What are the things that weren't possible before that are possible now because of these things? And which things have the fastest feedback loop so that I can know if we're wasting our time or not. Because anytime I'm, kind of in this space of blank canvas kind of ideating, the biggest risk for me is just opportunity cost. Right there are many, many things I could be working on, and trying to select the one that is the most beneficial or interesting or that kind of thing is something that I think a lot about. And I kind of gravitate towards the things in which I can get the most rich, dense, I don't exactly know how to describe it, information the fastest.
Okay.
No, also that.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, normally people dance around saying that, but yeah, I mean, fair enough. You're a candid fella.
Also that.
I am a mercenary.
Yeah, definitely that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's like some old kind of, cliches around, do something that you're genuinely interested in, do something that you don't have to force yourself to work to do, all these kind of things. And like, in many ways, I think that those are fundamentally true. But at the same time, like if the feedback loops take forever, you just simply don't know if things are working.
Right.
So I think that's a challenge. And being an engineer and kind of going through a PhD, which is a long and arduous process, the only thing that really kind of sustains you through that many kind of elongated milestones are the kind of short-term successes you can stack. This experiment worked and therefore I learned, or this experiment didn't work, and this kind of thing. So I think I have a company building in the same way. That said, there are just so many unknowns and uncontrollables. You can't fully, kind of systematize it.
Right. On my end, I'm so like I got really sick of software this year. I like for everyone here knows, like I was an electrical engineer by formal training, so I did like metal and architecture and everything. And as with most people my age, you see the money in tech and software, and you default go there naturally. Um, I think a lot of where my interest is going this year, I was alluding to earlier during the robotics and the threads of Apple conversation. I just think that there's a lot of energy right now for hardware that wasn't there before. And so I anticipate that I'll probably have a like robotics kind of like data latency, like infrastructure, like still software oriented product, hopefully like available to try and use within like next week before Christmas. The overall direction, I think, goal for 2026 is um, I want to make some robots, dude. I want to maybe not like a very little robot, but like some IoT set of devices. I think there's a lot that exists in and around the home, whether it's like elder care or whether it's like literal building maintenance. I just have a lot of experiments I want to run, and kind of in the same way Damon said, like fast iteration cycles matter. And for me, a lot of that means like literal proof that I can do the thing I'm imagining. My skill set's not warm for it, but um, follow the curiosity, like see what I can figure out, um, come to a prototype, hopefully relatively quickly, and see if that prototype is doing the job I need it to. Robotics is hard, timelines on robotics and IoT is hard, but there has to be some configuration of things, kind of as Dan was saying, that like the feedback cycle can be faster. I think bringing that like engineering thinking and doing software stuff in lane with that while working on the hard skills um, is hopefully going to manifest in what is an IoT company of some shape or another in the next year. So that's me. Thank
For the
you.
record, it's the best time to do it. I think, at
It is the
least that
best time to do it.
we've seen. Yeah.
Um, um, cool. Unless there are any other reflections, happy holidays to everyone listening. We hope you enjoyed the new year, and we hope you all had an excellent past 2025. Obviously, a lot of our audience is very business foundry oriented. We wish you great success in all of your next iterations. We hope you don't have many more pivots in front of you. Um, and to all, good luck and good fortune. Thank you for joining. We'll catch you all
Yeah. Merry Christmas.
soon.
Happy New Year. Yeah. See you on the other side.
Yeah. Yeah. Peace, y'all.
Peace.
Bye.